He had everything a man could ever want, yet he couldn't feel a single thing. That was the most terrifying part. Brandon Kessler sat alone in the grand hallway of his mountain estate, surrounded by silence so loud it drowned out even his own thoughts. The fire crackled in the oversized hearth behind him, but no warmth touched his skin. The light barely reached his eyes. He was 34, a billionaire, an icon of industry and innovation. People feared him. Investors worshipped him. The media followed his every move, and yet he hadn't laughed in over 3 years. His therapist called it emotional detachment, a side effect of unresolved trauma, post-traumatic stress. But Brandon didn't care for labels. All he knew was that since the day his mother passed and the day his ex-wife betrayed him all in the same week, something in him had gone dark. The world had gone colorless, and now 3 years later, here he was. Alive, breathing, empty. He thought he could manage it. Bury himself in work, buy more companies, attend events, pose for the cameras. But one night while sitting in the same armchair his mother used to read, something inside him cracked. He realized he had forgotten what it felt like to care, to feel joy, to cry, to want anything other than survival. And in that moment, something scared him more than death ever could. What if he had become incapable of being human? That night he didn't call a therapist. He didn't call an escort. He walked into the kitchen barefoot, past the polished marble counters, and sat down at the small wooden table near the back window. That was when he saw her, Ellie Sanders, 22, quiet, observant, the new housekeeper sent by the agency. She was mopping the floor, her sleeves rolled up, hair tied into a loose braid. She looked up startled but didn't flinch. She gave him a small, polite nod and kept working. He watched her for 10 minutes without saying a word. There was something different about her, something he couldn't quite name, and it annoyed him. The next morning, he asked his assistant to give him a full background check. Nothing unusual. Orphaned father, raised by her single mother, dropped out of nursing school due to finances, now working part-time to save enough to return. But there was one detail that caught his attention. Years ago, Brandon's mother had once stopped a woman from jumping off a city bridge. That woman was Ellie's mother. It hit him like a wave. Fate or coincidence? Either way, he suddenly felt something he hadn't in years: connection. And for the first time in a very long time, Brandon didn't feel entirely dead inside. 2 days later, he sat Ellie down at that same kitchen table. She was nervous. He was quiet. Then he said the words he never imagined himself saying. "I don't need your help cleaning. I need your help feeling again." She blinked, unsure she heard him right. "I'm not asking for love," Brandon said. "I'm not even asking for affection. I just need someone who's willing to help me remember what it means to be human, even if it's just once." Ellie looked at him, really looked at him. And despite everything she had been taught to protect, she asked a question that would change everything. "What if I'm willing?" And just like that, a story began. Not one of lust or duty, but of 2 broken people on the edge of their own ruins daring to step closer, even if it meant sacrificing everything they thought they were, even if it meant giving away the one thing they had been saving for someone else. Because sometimes it's not about falling in love, it's about choosing to feel even if it breaks you. Ellie Sanders had never imagined herself stepping into a place like the Kessler estate. The driveway alone stretched longer than the main street in her hometown. The mansions sat against the snow-covered hills of Montana, surrounded by silence pine trees and luxury she'd only seen in magazines. She wasn't intimidated by the size of it, though. What weighed heavier was the reason she was there. Her mother had told her stories about a woman who once saved her life, a stranger who stopped her from ending it all on a freezing bridge one night when Ellie was just a little girl. That woman had become her mother's friend helper and the only source of hope for a family that had nothing. That woman was Evelyn Kessler Brandon's late mother. So when Ellie heard about the job opening at the Kessler estate, she didn't hesitate. It wasn't about money, it was about paying a debt. But she didn't expect the man she would be working for to be so cold, so distant, so haunted. Brandon never smiled. He never looked at her unless necessary. He gave instructions through the house manager and mostly stayed locked inside his study or walked the snowy trails behind the estate in silence. At first, Ellie thought he was simply arrogant, like most rich men she had cleaned for. But it didn't take long to notice it wasn't arrogance. It was grief, and something deeper, something broken. She saw it in the way he sat alone at dinner, never touching the food, in how he walked into the library just to stare at the fire and leave minutes later, in how he paused at the hallway where a portrait of his mother still hung. His silence wasn't filled with pride, it was filled with pain. Ellie herself was no stranger to hardship. She had grown up watching her mother clean houses for people who barely acknowledged her. She worked through high school, graduated with a scholarship, started nursing school, but had to drop out when bills piled too high. She never dated, never partied, never had time for anything other than surviving. She kept her world small, her goals simple. Finish school, get a job, take care of her mom, and maybe one day learn to live a little. She didn't expect to learn anything from Brandon. She thought she'd clean his house, thank the Kessler name for what Evelyn had done years ago, and move on. But slowly, the house itself began to speak to her. The long, echoing halls whispered stories of people who had once lived loudly here. Rooms still held energy even if no one used them. Ellie found herself drawn to the music room, where dust lay over untouched piano keys, to the garden room where Evelyn's favorite orchids still bloomed despite the cold, and to Brandon's silence, which she learned to read like a language. She didn't know exactly when things shifted. Maybe it was the night she heard him pacing outside her door at midnight, or the morning he asked without looking up if she had slept well. Little cracks in his armor began to show. Brandon wasn't rude, he wasn't mean, he was tired of everything. And Ellie, with her soft presence, her quiet patience, and the warmth she carried even in silence, became the only human contact he allowed to exist in his orbit. She started leaving fresh tea outside his study. He started leaving her small notes. He once left a sticky note on the fridge that read, "Thank you for watering the orchids. That's something my mother used to do." It was the first time she saw his handwriting. Something so simple, so human. That's when she realized this wasn't a billionaire towering above her. This was a man holding himself together by threads. And somehow she had been placed there not just to clean his home, but maybe to remind him what a home even was. Brandon noticed it too, the way her presence shifted the energy in the house. It was like the air moved differently when she was near. She didn't ask him questions. She didn't demand anything. She was just there, steady. And that steadiness began to calm something raging inside him. One morning while she cleaned the reading room, she found a book left open with a single sentence underlined. It read, "Some souls are too quiet to be noticed, but loud enough to be remembered forever." She didn't know if he meant her, but it made her heart race anyway. It started with a mug of tea. Brandon was never the type to drink anything other than his usual black coffee, served at exactly 6:30 every morning. But that day when he entered his study, the mug on his desk was different. Steam curled softly from a cup of chamomile. No note, no explanation. Just the scent of something calming. He almost ignored it. Almost. But something made him stop. He sat down, lifted the cup, and took a sip. It wasn't spectacular, but it wasn't bitter. For the first time in months, the warmth of something lingered on his tongue. He glanced at the security monitor in the corner of the room. It showed a small figure in the kitchen, quietly cleaning the counters. Ellie. That night, Brandon couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind scrape against the windows, and wondered what it meant to feel peace. Over the next few days, Ellie continued to leave little things. A folded blanket at the armchair in the library, a polished frame of his mother's favorite photo restored from a dusty corner. She never mentioned them, never sought recognition, and that disturbed him more than if she had asked for a raise. One night he asked his assistant to fire her. No explanation, just remove her. But when the morning came and the house felt emptier than usual, he called it off. She stayed. And the next time she saw him, she smiled like nothing had changed. Brandon started watching her more closely. She had a softness to her, a kind of grace that didn't come from training. When she moved, it was like she was walking through someone else's world, carefully as though she didn't belong, but respected every inch of it. She made no demands. She didn't flirt. She simply existed, and her presence became necessary. One morning, while she was dusting the old bookshelf in the east wing, he walked in and stood there saying nothing. She looked at him, smiled slightly, and kept working. After a few minutes, she spoke. "You don't have to pretend to be invisible when you're hurting." Brandon didn't respond, but her words stayed with him. That night, he poured himself a glass of whiskey, sat in his mother's favorite chair, and stared into the fire. Ellie walked in quietly, saw him there and hesitated. "Sit," he said. She did. For minutes they said nothing. Then Brandon turned to her. "Do you believe people can come back from the edge?" She didn't ask what edge. She simply answered, "I believe people aren't always meant to be saved. Sometimes they just need someone to sit beside them in the dark." His throat tightened. He didn't know why. He hadn't cried in years, but the weight in his chest was shifting. Ellie began telling him stories. Nothing dramatic, just small moments from her childhood. Her mother humming to old songs. A neighbor who taught her how to bake. The day her college acceptance letter came in the mail. And he listened, really listened. Days passed like that. Quiet conversations, shared silences, glimpses of a life he had long forgotten was possible. Then came the night it all changed. A storm rolled through the hills, lightning streaking across the sky. Power flickered. Brandon was in the study pacing. Memories of hospitals, the smell of his mother's final days, the voice of his ex-wife echoing in his head. He couldn't breathe. He opened the window, letting cold air crash against his face. Ellie found him there trembling. She didn't speak. She stepped forward and placed a blanket around his shoulders. Her hand brushed his, warmth against frost. He looked at her, really looked, and something broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for him to whisper, "I don't feel anything. I want to, but I don't. I can't." She met his eyes. What if you don't need to feel everything all at once? What if you just need to feel one thing deeply, even for a second? What if I could give you that? He stared at her, confused, afraid, hopeful. Why would you do that? Because your mother saved mine. Because you don't deserve to die inside like this. Because I think something inside you is still trying to live. He laughed bitterly. You're too young to understand what life takes from people. She stepped closer, and maybe you've forgotten what life can give. His breath caught. For a moment, neither of them moved. The wind howled through the window. He closed it slowly and turned back to her. You should go. Ellie didn't move. Instead, she reached for his hand, placed it against her own chest. Do you feel that, my heart? It's scared, but it's beating. Let me give you something real, just once, even if it's the only time. He pulled away. Don't do this out of pity. I'm not. I'm doing this because I see something in you worth saving. I don't want your money. I don't want a contract. I just want to give you something no one else has. He looked down. You're a virgin, aren't you? Yes, and you're willing to give that up. For me, for this, not because I owe you, not because I want something, but because if you leave this world tomorrow, I want you to know what it's like to be touched with kindness, not ownership, not control, just love. Brandon's hands trembled. He wanted to scream. He wanted to run. Instead, he whispered, "Why me?" She answered, "Because when I look at you, I don't see a billionaire. I see a man who's been surviving instead of living. And I know what that feels like." That night, he didn't sleep. Neither did she. They stayed in the study until morning, talking, crying, laughing softly, healing. And when the sun rose, casting golden light across the broken stone of the estate, Brandon asked her one question. Are you sure? She nodded. I've never been more sure of anything. Then he took her hand, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt something. The days that followed were quieter, but not in the same hollow way they used to be. There was a different kind of silence in the house, now one filled with meaning. Brandon moved through his rooms with less tension in his shoulders. Ellie noticed how he no longer kept the curtains closed. He started spending more time near the windows, watching the wind in the trees. He even began joining her in the kitchen, just standing there watching her slice fruit, or stir a pot, sometimes offering to help. He was awkward, unsure, like a man learning to walk again after years of stillness. But he was present. She felt it. One morning, Ellie placed a plate of toast in front of him and said softly, "You're breathing differently." He looked up, startled. "Breathing, yes." She smiled. It used to sound like survival. Now it sounds like choice. Brandon didn't answer. Instead, he reached for the toast and took a bite. It was dry. He smiled anyway. But there was still a weight in the corners of his eyes, a shadow that refused to lift. One afternoon, while Ellie dusted the library, she came across an old box tucked behind a row of untouched books. Curious, she pulled it out. Inside were photos, letters, cards, pieces of Brandon's life that had been hidden away. One envelope was addressed to Evelyn Kessler, written in a trembling hand. It was from Ellie's mother. She unfolded the letter and read the words her mother had once written. You saved me that night. You pulled me from the edge, not just of the bridge, but of my life. My daughter is the reason I breathe, and you are the reason she still has a mother. I owe you everything." Ellie's throat tightened. She sat down, clutching the letter, realizing just how deep this connection went. She wasn't here by coincidence. She was the continuation of a kindness, a debt her mother had never truly repaid. Later that evening, she showed Brandon the letter. He stared at it for a long time, his jaw clenched, his eyes unreadable. "I didn't know she wrote this," he said. "She did. She meant every word." Brandon held the letter gently, then folded it and placed it back in the box. "My mother always said we're not meant to carry the same pain forever. We're supposed to pass on the healing too." Ellie looked at him. "Maybe that's what we're doing. Maybe that's why I'm here." But Brandon wasn't ready to believe in fate. Not yet. That night he didn't come to dinner. Ellie searched the house and found him in the basement, sitting on the floor beside old furniture, holding a picture of his ex-wife. She was beautiful, blonde, smiling. The photo was cracked. Ellie sat beside him without speaking. She didn't ask questions. Eventually he spoke. Her name was Camille. "I met her when I was 28. She was a sculptor, wild, free. The kind of woman who makes you feel like life is art. I thought I loved her. I did in some way. But she loved the idea of me, the billionaire, the son of Evelyn Kessler, not the man." Ellie listened as he continued. "She left the day my mother died. I came home from the hospital heartbroken and found her packing her bags. She said she couldn't live in a house filled with grief. She said I was becoming a ghost." He let out a bitter laugh. She wasn't wrong, but it still destroyed me. That was the day I stopped feeling anything. I shut everything down. Every room in this house, every emotion in my body. I wasn't afraid of being alone. I was afraid of being left again. Ellie reached for his hand. "You're not alone now." "I know," he whispered, "but I don't know how to trust what I feel. What if this is temporary? What if I break again?" She squeezed his hand. "Then we rebuild again, together." The vulnerability in his eyes was raw. He nodded slowly. Later that week, Ellie found him sitting at the piano. She had never heard him play before. His fingers moved with hesitation, striking gentle notes that sounded more like memories than music. He stopped when he noticed her. "Don't stop," she said. "It's beautiful." He shook his head. "I used to play for my mother. She said music was where my soul came out. I haven't touched it since she died." Ellie sat beside him on the bench. "Then maybe it's time to bring her back through this. And through you." Brandon looked at her. "Do you believe we can love again after we've been broken?" Ellie's answer was soft but certain. "I believe love is what teaches us we're still alive, even if it hurts, especially if it hurts." Their closeness deepened not through touch but through truth. The more Brandon shared, the more Ellie saw the boy behind the armor. The child who had grown up in a house of expectations. The son who had never learned how to grieve. The man who had learned how to build walls, but not how to take them down. One morning, Brandon surprised Ellie. He handed her a manila envelope. Inside was a full scholarship to return to nursing school, paid in full. A note was attached. "You helped me breathe again. Now let me help you become who you were always meant to be." Ellie's hands trembled. "I didn't do this for rewards." "I know," he said. "That's why you deserve it." She didn't cry then, not in front of him. But that night alone in her room she did. Not because she was sad, but because something had shifted. She had come to this house to repay a debt. Instead, she had found a reason to stay. A few days later, as they walked through the garden behind the estate, Brandon paused and said, "I don't think I'm afraid of feeling anymore." Ellie smiled. Then what are you afraid of now? That I'll never feel this way again. She took his hand. Then let's not waste it. They stood there in silence, surrounded by the wind, the sky the last of the autumn leaves, falling around them like whispers of a past, slowly letting go. Brandon turned to her. There's something I need to ask. She looked up. Anything. That night, that first night. Was it just for me? Ellie's voice didn't waver. It was for us. For the chance to feel something real. For the moment we chose each other, even if we didn't know what that meant yet. Brandon nodded. He placed a kiss on her forehead and whispered, Then let's not stop choosing, not now, not ever. The snow began to fall heavier in the weeks that followed, coating the estate in a soft white silence. The days grew shorter, the nights longer, and the world outside seemed to slow down. Inside the mansion, though something was awakening, Brandon had changed, not overnight and not without effort, but enough for those who looked closely to see it. He started reading again. Not business reports or financial journals, but novels. He opened the windows in rooms he hadn't entered in years. He even allowed the staff to decorate for the holidays, something he had banned since his mother's death. Ellie was the center of it all, without forcing, without demanding. She had brought color back into his grayscale life. But with change comes fear. Brandon knew the world was watching him. He was still a public figure, a man whose name carried weight, and whose life choices often made headlines. And though he had hidden Ellie from that world, it was only a matter of time before curiosity found its way to his door. The first crack came during a board meeting. He hadn't been attending many lately, delegating to trusted partners while focusing on healing. But this time he appeared. When one of the executives questioned his absences, Brandon simply said, Life reminded me that no amount of money is worth losing your soul. Some respected him more for that. Others saw it as weakness. The rumors started. The media began speculating. Anonymous sources hinted that Brandon Kessler had taken in a young maid. Some tabloids twisted it, calling her a secret lover, a gold digger, a distraction. Ellie saw the stories by accident while scrolling through her phone one morning. She said nothing to Brandon. She didn't want to burden him. But he found out anyway. His assistant stormed into his study with a stack of clippings and a warning. They're coming for her. He stared at the headlines, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. Later that night, he sat with Ellie by the fire. She could sense something was wrong. What is it? She asked. He hesitated, then showed her the articles. Her face paled, but she didn't cry. She only asked one question. Do you regret it? Being with me, Brandon reached for her hand. No, never. Then we'll face it together, she said. He nodded, but deep down he knew this was only the beginning. The next few days were a whirlwind. Paparazzi outside the gates. Reporters calling distant relatives. Old business partners demanding explanations. One morning, Brandon's legal team advised him to issue a public statement. Distance yourself, they said. Tell the press she was temporary help. Say nothing happened. Protect your name. Brandon looked at them, then quietly said, If I lie about her, I lose everything worth protecting. He walked out. That night, he found Ellie in the library. She was sitting by the window, looking out at the snow. I don't want to be the reason your world burns down, she said. You're not, he answered. You're the reason I want to rebuild it. But the pressure mounted. Investors threatened to pull funding. Charities canceled events. The foundation his mother built was under scrutiny. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside their lives. And then the worst happened. A private photo leaked, a grainy image of Brandon and Ellie sitting close in the garden, his hand on hers. It wasn't scandalous, it was intimate, too intimate. Headlines exploded. Young maid seduces grieving billionaire. Inheritance rumors swirl. Gold digger or guardian angel. Brandon knew Ellie was reaching her limit. She tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She kept working, kept pretending nothing had changed. But late one night, he heard her crying. He found her in the guest room, sitting on the floor, her phone on the carpet. "They're tearing you apart because of me," she whispered. He knelt beside her. "No, they're trying to tear apart what they don't understand. Then maybe I should leave." "Don't say that. Maybe you'd be better off." Brandon grabbed her shoulders. "Look at me." She did. "You are not a mistake. You are not an embarrassment. You are the only thing that feels right in this entire world." He pulled her into his arms, and for a long time neither of them spoke, just held each other, grounding themselves in the only truth that mattered. The next morning, Brandon called a press conference. He stood in front of dozens of cameras reporters, waiting like vultures. His statement was short. "I've spent my life building an empire, but none of it matters if I can't protect the one person who reminded me what it means to be human. Her name is Ellie Sanders. She is not a maid. She is not a secret. She is my peace. And if that costs me everything, then so be it." The room went silent. The footage went viral. Half the world admired him. The other half mocked him. But for the first time, Brandon didn't care. He returned home to find Ellie in the kitchen, tears streaming down her face. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I did," he replied, "because you are worth it." A week later, things began to settle. The media moved on. The board accepted his decision. Life resumed. But something inside Brandon had shifted permanently. He no longer walked in fear of perception. He walked in truth. And that truth included Ellie. One evening, as they sat under the stars on the back porch, Brandon took out a small box. Ellie's breath caught. He opened it. Inside wasn't a ring. It was a single silver key. "This house has always felt like a museum. Quiet, cold, full of ghosts. I want to build something different now. With you." He placed the key in her hand. "I'm not asking you to marry me. Not yet. I'm asking you to stay, to help me make this a home again." Ellie looked at the key, then at him. Her answer was a whisper. "I already did." The winter thawed slowly, and with it the tension that had gripped the mansion for months began to melt away. Brandon was no longer the man he had been. His eyes held light again, subtle but steady, and his voice softened when he spoke to Ellie. He no longer lived inside the shell of old grief. He had stepped out into something fragile, uncertain, but alive. Ellie returned to school part-time, commuting between campus and the estate. She spent her mornings studying, her afternoons caring for the house, and her evenings with Brandon. It wasn't a fairy tale. There were days they argued, days they misunderstood each other, but always they returned to the quiet understanding that had built the foundation of their bond. And then came the letter. It arrived in a plain envelope, no return address. Brandon opened it in his study, expecting another article or inquiry. Instead, it contained a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was unmistakable. It belonged to Camille. He hadn't heard from her in over 3 years. The words were brief. "I heard about the girl. I hope she's real. I hope she gives you what I never could. I'm sorry I couldn't be more than a lesson. Take care of her." Brandon sat in silence for a long time. Ellie found him there, the letter trembling in his hand. He handed it to her without speaking. She read it, then folded it carefully and placed it on the desk. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I think so," he said. "It doesn't change anything. It just reminds me how far I've come." She leaned into him, and they stayed that way until the sun dipped below the hills. The next day, Brandon began planning something quietly. He didn't tell Ellie. He spent hours in the guest house working with contractors, making calls, sketching ideas. Ellie grew curious but didn't press him. Then one morning he took her by the hand and led her outside. Snow still clung to the edges of the trees, but spring was coming. The air had shifted. He brought her to the guest house. It looked the same from the outside, but inside it had transformed. Light hardwood floors, warm cream walls, shelves lined with books. A small piano in the corner, a fireplace surrounded by soft chairs, and in the center a large wooden table covered in art supplies. "What is this?" she whispered. "This is yours," Brandon said, "for when you need to be alone, or when you need to create, or when the world feels too loud. I wanted you to have a space that was just yours." Ellie stepped inside, slowly touching the shelves, running her fingers along the piano keys. "You made this for me, I made it for us. A space to begin something new, something that isn't defined by what we were, but by what we can become." Her eyes welled with tears. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything," he said. "Just stay." She nodded, unable to speak. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of their life deepened. Brandon began to write again, something he hadn't done since college. He filled notebooks with thoughts, poems, letters he never sent. Ellie painted something she had given up after high school. The guest house became a refuge, a sacred space they shared without rules. One night, as rain tapped gently against the windows, Brandon turned to her. "I want to take you somewhere." Where, she asked. "Somewhere I've never taken anyone." He drove her to the outskirts of town, to an old lake house hidden among tall pines. It was the place his parents used to escape to in the summers. He hadn't been back since his mother died. But now, with Ellie beside him, the ghosts felt less threatening. They walked along the dock, the wood creaking beneath their feet. The lake was still reflecting the moon like a mirror. Brandon turned to her. "There's something I haven't told you." Ellie waited. "I used to come here as a boy when things felt too heavy. My mother said the water listened. After she died, I stopped coming. I thought silence meant pain, but now I know silence can mean peace." He took her hands. "I love you, Ellie." She stared at him, breath catching. "You don't have to say it back. I just needed you to know." But she did say it back, with tears in her eyes, with her whole heart open. "I love you too, Brandon." They returned home with a new kind of stillness between them. Not distance, but depth, a knowing, a choice. And then without warning, it happened. Brandon collapsed. It was early morning. Ellie was in the kitchen. She heard the sound, a dull thud, and ran. He was on the floor of the hallway, unconscious, breathing shallow. She called for help. The ambulance came. Hours passed in the hospital. Tests, scans, questions. The doctors called it a vascular anomaly, a rare condition that had been quietly growing for years, a ticking time bomb. "We caught it just in time," the doctor said. "Surgery is risky, but without it, he won't make it through the year." Ellie sat beside his bed, holding his hand. He was pale, weak, but conscious. You should have told me you weren't feeling well. I didn't know, he whispered. Or maybe I didn't want to. Brandon underwent surgery 3 days later. It lasted 7 hours. Ellie waited, pacing, praying, hoping. When the doctor came out, his face was unreadable. He made it, but it was close. He's in recovery now. You can see him soon? She exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. When she entered the room, Brandon was awake, barely. Tubes in his arms, monitors beeping steadily. He looked at her and tried to smile. You stayed. Of course I did. I don't deserve you. Maybe not, but you still have me. His eyes closed, her hand remained in his. Days passed. He recovered slowly. Each hour brought more strength, more clarity. One evening, as she helped him sit up, he whispered, "There's one thing I regret, what that I never asked you to marry me." She froze. He looked at her. "Will you?" She smiled through tears. "I thought you'd never ask." Yes, I will." They didn't need a big wedding, just the two of them in the garden, behind the mansion, under the same tree where he first held her hand. No guests, no press, just vows whispered into the breeze. Promises made with quiet certainty. I promise to feel. I promise to stay. I promise to choose you every day. And with that, they began a new chapter. Not perfect, not without struggle, but real. And in the end, that was more than enough. The seasons changed again. Summer came with golden skies, blooming wildflowers, and long, quiet afternoons filled with music, laughter, and shared silence. The estate no longer felt like a monument to loneliness. It felt lived in. It felt alive. Brandon and Ellie fell into a rhythm that was slow and steady, never rushed. They woke up together each morning with the sun spilling across their sheets. They drank coffee by the window, sometimes talking, sometimes just holding hands, and watching the world wake up. The guest house turned into a little creative haven where Ellie painted and Brandon wrote. There were days when the past still knocked on their door, when Brandon's body ached from surgery, or when a memory threatened to break through the peace they had built. But those days no longer had the power to pull them apart. They had already made the choice to stay. One afternoon, Ellie found Brandon on the back porch, a book resting on his lap, their dog curled beside him. She walked up behind him and kissed the top of his head. He looked up at her, his expression soft, full of quiet gratitude. "Did I ever tell you how scared I was? That first night I asked you for help?" he asked. "You didn't have to," she said. "I could see it in your eyes." He took her hand and placed it over his chest. "It's different now. I feel everything. Joy, sadness, love, fear. It's overwhelming sometimes, but it's real. I thought I was broken beyond repair, Ellie. But you didn't try to fix me. You just stayed." She sat beside him. "That's because I didn't fall in love with a broken man. I fell in love with someone brave enough to heal." They sat there as the wind rustled through the trees, the sound of summer whispering around them. Brandon turned to her. "Do you ever regret it, giving me that part of you?" "Your first time." She didn't answer immediately. Then she looked into his eyes and said, "I gave you my first time, yes. But more than that, I gave you my trust, my heart. And I'd do it again 1,000 times. Because you were the first man who didn't ask me to be less. You let me be exactly who I was." They kissed not out of habit, but out of recognition. A knowing that love wasn't built in grand gestures, but in daily decisions, to show up, to speak truth, to be present. Months passed. Ellie returned to school full-time and graduated. Brandon stepped back from his empire and began investing in wellness centers and mental health programs. Together they started a foundation in Evelyn Kessler's name, helping young women who had lost direction find purpose again. Their story wasn't one of perfection. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was deeply human, real, tender, alive, and in a world that often forgot what love meant, theirs was a quiet reminder. Love isn't just something you feel, it's something you choose, again and again, even when it's hard, even when it hurts, especially then. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills and cast a warm glow across the estate, Ellie stood in the garden with Brandon's arms wrapped around her from behind. They watched the sky turn shades of pink and orange. She leaned back into him and whispered, "Do you remember the first thing you said to me?" He smiled. "I said I needed your help feeling again." "And did I help?" she asked. He kissed her temple. "You gave me everything." And as they stood there surrounded by peace, they had fought to find, Ellie whispered one last truth. "I didn't save you, Brandon. You just needed someone to remind you that you were worth saving. That was all." The wind carried her words into the dusk, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the past, not the noise, just the simple fact that sometimes love doesn't rescue you. It just reminds you that you still deserve to be whole.